So James, someone who's really working on the ground with both nonprofit organizations and leaders and really helping to make the right match there, what are your observations about what really matters for leadership? What are important leadership qualities in nonprofit executives and teams that help launch, particularly that help launch and sustain successful scaling efforts?
Yeah, thank you. Well, thank you for organizing this panel, for having us here today. Huge subject, very small amount of time to discuss it. So there's clearly a lot of different leadership character traits that make for successful scaling ventures. There's the whole concept of flexibility and adaptability. There's having a clear vision of where you're headed and being able to backwards plan from that and understand what will take your organization from each stage of scaling to the next. But if I only have a few minutes to talk about one thing in particular, I want to sort of open up this, it's like if you're working on a big Excel spreadsheet and then all of a sudden it says, oh, you've got a circular reference. I would say the number one leadership trait that drives successful scaling ventures is an understanding of successful leadership traits that scale ventures. These organizations who really take a people-first orientation and understand that the talent in their organizations is the alpha and the omega, it's where everything begins and ends. They immediately start asking themselves, as Jim Collins encouraged us to ask first who, then what? And there's only a handful of them, I would say, and there's some of the most highly successful ventures in our field. But the leadership in those organizations really start by looking at, before I do anything else, how do I get the absolute best talent possible into my organization? How do I manage those people successfully to prepare them for success? And how do I cultivate them over time? I think that certainly we've seen an emergence of hiring more chief talent officers, chief people officers, director of strategic human capital, whatever you want to call it. Increasingly successful organizations are outsourcing the way that we've thought about HR in the nonprofit sector for quite some time. It's the way the corporate sector really stopped thinking about it in 1950. The nonprofit sector and the social sector got kind of stuck. But we're outsourcing the administrative function of HR, and we're bringing in strategic human capital leaders to really think at a high level about how to cultivate and build teams. And recognizing that teams have to be made up of complementary and diverse leadership traits and skills. So there's a concept many of you may be familiar with, a lot of organizations in our field use it. CDER trains off of it a lot, the leadership compass. So saying that, and that there may be north leaders who are important, people who are just going to be hard driving, tactically oriented, pushing forward towards goals, east leaders who are going to be very creative, innovative and out of the box. South leaders are going to be more humanistic and understand empathically what the different elements of the team are, and West leaders are going to be more analytical, and making sure that no organization is sort of burdened with trying to look at itself as having any one leader possessing too much of the spectrum, but rather how do we put together teams that work really well together, and understanding also that organizations need different things at different points in their trajectory. So Anne, your colleagues at TCC Group did a lot of really interesting research about how leadership and management practices get better and better as organizations grow from startup until 1 million. And then when they hit the $1 million point around having 10 people on staff, it starts to drop off precipitously. And that's because in most of the nonprofit sector, which is mostly small organizations, we sort of get how to manage our friends, 5 or 6 close colleagues who we like and we feel comfortable going out for drinks with after work to get something done. But then when you want to cross over to have 15, 20, 25, 30 people on staff, it's not about managing people anymore, having one person on staff who's capable of managing people. Then we sort of break into managing managers and moving towards a culture of accountability and performance management. That's where a lot of those, the emergence or the failure to emerge of those character traits in building leadership in an organization really make or break the difference of whether you get past 10 million and you can sort of get to and past that stage. And after 10 million, it's not about managing managers anymore and the culture of accountability. It's really about how do you scale and replicate the systems, the profiles, the vision. This is what we know worked in this unit. How are we going to make it work in other cities that have very different geographic components? So long-winded response touching on a number of different topic areas that I'm I'm sure we'll get a chance to discuss, and maybe there are perspectives and questions in the audience. But in the end, it's all about leadership talent. If you want to scale your venture successfully, you have to put people first. You have to think about it first. And we've gotten good at sort of starting to think about the strategic recruiting and hiring, which is most of my day job. It's great that organizations are building internal core competencies around that, but we're still very weak as a sector around cultivating leadership from within, about training and managing and developing talent. And that's something that all of us have recognized there's a huge gap in the sector, and have been working together for the last year intensively on trying to develop some solutions around that.
Great, thank you. A lot of questions I want to ask you following up on that, but we'll turn to Michaela. Could you talk about one of the response that you and your colleagues are working on in particular that I think James was just alluding to, the Initiative for Nonprofit Talent and Leadership. Why now? Why is it relevant? And particularly for this audience, what does it mean for scaling impact?
Great. Well, I want to pick up on something James started off. Good evening, everyone. I want to pick up on something James started off talking about, which he talked about organizations with a people orientation. And what we're trying to build is a sector with that. Essentially, our belief is that that when we think about leadership and leadership development, it's actually the most efficient and effective means we have to do X. So whatever that impact is, in this case, I think many of you are looking to, obviously it's have the impact, and then how do you scale that? So to James's point, there are certain qualities and pieces associated. We know no matter what the result you're looking to get, this is actually, I wouldn't even say one of the most effective, it's really the effective way to do it and to think about it. So one of the things, I'm going to talk a little bit about kind of where we are now, and I don't know if people have before you something that looks somewhat like this, or exactly like this, actually. But I want to emphasize, I'm going to talk a little bit about that specifically, but talk about basically where we are now, where we're hoping to go, and then give you a little bit of background. So James talked some about how many of us came together, and I feel like we actually sit on this stage sort of on the shoulders of many who come before, and we actually have all these people behind us who you can't see, and some of you are out there actually, I think, so some of you in front of us who are part of this initiative, and our hope is, I think in some ways by the end of this, and as we go through this process over the next several months, that all of you, or many of you, will see yourselves as invested in this as we do. Because I would imagine to a person here, those of us who are out there doing this work, whether it's as a practitioner, whether it's as a funder, you see some of the challenges that we're going to identify. So one of those challenges we saw was really about investment. And when we say that, we don't just mean, this is critically important, we don't just mean money. We don't mean finances. We also mean investment of our time, attention, and resources. In an economy like now, there are often, people have to look at serious opportunities within their organization to cut, to make changes. And one of the things that tends to go is whether it's from professional development or coaching or other kinds of leadership interventions that could have the most impact at a time when things are tough are the things that people pull. And we're looking to say at this time, the most complex challenges we've ever faced in an economy we have, that it's critically important actually to invest in it. And again, it's not just some outside investment, it's how you structure your organization, it's how you think about how you're structured, and that there are really some models and practices out there that we hope people will, that will not only be able to elevate, that other people will be able to learn from. So we have this, this set of goals, which you'll see on this back page of the document you have, which which ultimately spell RISE, which is no accident. Because our belief is that we will collectively rise, that there will be something that happens to us as a social sector if we make these investments along the way. If we make these investments, we will see more thriving leaders, we'll see communities change, we'll see greater impact through these steps. So we're in a period now where we're talking about how do we rally the sector. So this conversation we're having with you, we've been having conversations with a number of different kinds of audiences and different people, essentially to both get input on this document. So I really want to emphasize, this is not to share this with you and say, like, here's our plan and, you know, there you go. It's more to say, we want your input, and there's actually indicated in here the way to do that, and we'll emphasize that at the end too. And also to share out and get, you know, have these kinds of conversations. Some of my colleagues, James, another set of our colleagues are going to be at the Points of Light conference next week, where we held a series of events in May to get this kind of input and really critical feedback on this. So to say to us, you need to be more specific in this way, it needs to be clearer in this way, it needs to include different groups, it needs to be stronger in this area. So we're really looking for that. Secondly, and I think this is one of the things I know, just thinking about the models and what you've been doing here this afternoon with the business plan competition, it's to identify those models. It's to identify what's really good and how can we support, elevate, and ultimately offer some of the opportunities at a larger scale that you're doing here, which is to get people to invest in the right ways in the high-quality programs, high-quality leadership development for the sector. And then ultimately, of course, to engage, which is in our case, really about, again, ensuring that there is also a level of financial investment over time that we can hold. We're at a particular inflection point, I think, because over the next few months, as I said, we're going to continue these conversations. We're continuing to refine this. So I can't say it enough. Your input will be directly read, listened to, and considered, and we'll probably communicate back with you at this stage. Our goal is that by the end of this year, we have a credible, informed, thoughtful plan with clear impacts and measures to say this is what we need to do to ensure quality leadership development in the sector, and here are the ways we're going to track that and understand that and work and mobilize the resources in the sector over the next 3 years. Because one of the things we're very clear about is not that there's no investment, that there's a coherence missing, that there's an opportunity here, but there are pockets. I think of it, I've recently been thinking about it a lot when we talk about food security, and you'll hear people say, the food deserts. And yet there are places where there's like the Whole Foods down the block from the Dean and DeLuca, right? Or you're at a farmland, and it's like fully, the abundance of organic produce because you're picking it, right? So there's all of this variety. There's actually a lot of places, though, where we know that they really are kind of these deserts. And that they're not getting the opportunities that they might get to support the organizations.
Perfect.
So, thanks.
Thank you. And we're going to turn now to Rafael Lopez, who's with the Annie Casey Foundation, which has made a pretty systematic commitment to nurturing leadership and talent management in the sector, and to really raising the visibility and credibility of the importance of the issue. So Rafael, can you talk a little bit about promising practices and efforts and initiatives that you've seen both around leadership development and talent management, why are they important, and the promise they hold for the sector as a whole, and whether they're scalable in and of themselves, how we might go about doing that?
Sure, thank you. Good afternoon. So kind of building on Michaela's point about lifting up what works, it's important to sort of give context to sort of Casey's perspective on this and point of view. And the literature has told us in looking at talent and leadership development programs nationally, both for the social sector as well as the private sector, is that there always has to be context for your core business. And if Casey's core business is about investing in the nation's most vulnerable children, families, and communities, then it would make sense that over the last 2 decades that all of our talent and leadership development programs are directly linked towards those improving results around that population of children, youth, and families and communities in this country that are most vulnerable. And so I want to make that context, which is really important, because as we scanned the literature and did our research about our new thinking about this, Casey developed a human capital framework that's really about sort of 5 essential building blocks. This is based on some of the best practices and research we could find. So first, the importance of connecting, building, and tapping into networks, keeping oneself connected, door-opening opportunities, particularly for people that don't always have those opportunities before them. Secondly, the importance of attracting talent, both to Casey as well as for the field. In developing our human capital framework, it was important to both look internally, what are the challenges and struggles we were having, and developing a framework both for Casey's staff. We're 500 staff, 300 of which are direct services, and 200 of which are on the grant-making side, as well as building it for the many thousands of grantees in whom we invest over time. Third was developing very specific competencies and capacities of individuals and organizations. So for example, with Casey's National Children and Family Fellowship, there's been over 20 years, 93 fellows that are across the United States. And in that, very much specifically developing competencies such as using oneself as an agent of change, being able to have dialogues around race, class, and culture, being able to use data to make tough decisions at whatever point of the organization you're leading. The fourth building block is around deploying talent where it is needed and well matched. Not just for Casey, but again for our grantees in the field. And fifth, retaining that talent. And those 5 building blocks, you can sort of change some of the adjectives, and you can imagine that many of them are already in existence in various private sector as well as social sector organizations across the country. But I wanted to make sure we started with the context because Casey has a point of view about this, and that's actually very much reflected in the literature. What I thought might be interesting for this group in particular is looking at, there was a 2001 study commissioned by the Army. And for whatever your take is on the Army, it actually has one of the most well-developed and robust talent and leadership development programs. Why? Because talent matters. Leadership matters when you're actually, whether you're on a battlefield or you're actually preparing for thinking about water systems in the various places in the country or around the world where we are. And what was interesting is that they actually looked at best practices in the private sector and lifted up, much like Michaela was talking about, those companies that exemplified best practices in terms of talent leadership development. And some of them are organizations like PepsiCo, General Electric. But what was interesting to me and to Casey was that when we looked at those practices, they are practices that are already embedded in the social sector, in social enterprises. And they're things that wouldn't surprise you. Things like 360-degree feedback, executive coaching, mentoring, stretch assignments, developing expansive networks. Those are 5 of many best practices that actually are scaled deep within organizations and also within leadership and talent programs across the country within the social sector. What was also interesting is looking at the commonalities from this Army research base, and for those of you that are interested, please stop by afterwards and I'm happy to send you the link and the copy of the paper. But again, looking at the commonalities again between the private sector and the social sector around general best practice principles. And I wanted to focus on a couple of those before I sort of take you in a different direction. One was around successful leadership development efforts require the engagement of a high-level official, hopefully the CEO, setting the tone and the message that investing in human capital through consistent talent and leadership development programs matters, not just for your bottom line, but in terms of your core business structure, as I connected that to sort of Casey's vision from its perspective. Secondly, that leadership capacity is everywhere, that programs that only focus on the sort of C-level suite or executives aren't really taking into account the capacity of the talent that exists throughout an organization. How do you invest in talent at multiple layers of the organization? How do you deepen your bench and build the bench so that people like James can recruit them at different parts of organizations? So that as Michaela talks about initiative, there's places to plug and play people from different perspectives and backgrounds. And there are sort of 9 general practices, and I want to highlight just a few of them. And the third one I wanted to highlight is around the importance of leaders, that the most important job of a leader is to groom other leaders. James mentioned this earlier, but how you do that at different stages of scaling and at different moments in an organization's, be it private or public or social sector, that it matters immensely. And thinking about the job of leaders changes not just with the number of people that are in your organization at one given moment in time, but ultimately how you see your vision for the future and the importance of developing in your talent so that they are the future of your organization and it's the future of its culture. But ultimately, all of the things I just talked about are actually, I think, shifting dramatically in this country and around the world. Sort of the pace of change has changed dramatically. And ultimately, all of these leadership development programs, the kind of best practices I just highlighted, are very high-level touch, one-on-one, generally speaking, and costly. And I think that we're at an inflection point as a society around how to actually radically disrupt that way of doing business. That if you look to organizations and institutions like MIT, Harvard, UCLA, UC Berkeley, who are rethinking even access to their undergraduate programs online to actually capture for free a lot more of an audience. One could imagine that for our sector, be you a social enterprise organization or a social sector or even the public sector, how can we beg, borrow, and steal our innovative programs from across the sectors, from a much more cross-sector approach on an online platform that could at least rise the level of people who are being engaged in, at all levels of organization, basic talent and leadership development programs. And I wanted to sort of make the economic argument for that. So first of all, when you think about the nonprofit sector specifically, there are over 1.6 million registered nonprofits that are 501c3 organizations in this country, employing over 10% of the United States workforce. That's not chump change. When you think about the number of growth in the last decade of nonprofit organizations, they grew by 60%, that, again, reported by the IRS. And that the GDP worth of output from our sector is $751 billion. I also wanted to think about actually the change in sort of the structures, that 501c3s and 501c4s are no longer the only vehicles. So you think about the growth in B Corps and how that's actually radically transforming much of the organizations you lead. And so at the very end of the day, all of the social sector big networks, Teach for America, Public Allies, Atlas Corps, the Casey Fellowship, the White House Fellows, they're for a small number of people at a particular moment in time, and we could not reach scale unless we disrupt how we do business. So the sort of the call to action for all of you here is to think about employing those best practices within the work that's core to your business and disrupting how we do things. Because I think ultimately it's this disruption and sort of a democratization around how we access this program that's going to really transform our sector and really help us all rise.
Thank you. And Richard will wrap things up in terms of the presentation by talking about the role of the funder in supporting leadership for scaling initiatives. And what can funders do to support this work?
So appreciate the comments of my colleagues, and particularly in reference to what Raphael talked about and the type of work that the Annie Casey Foundation. And I would imagine that the folks at Annie Casey are a more traditional type of funder when it comes to the idea of funding leadership in the nonprofit sector. American Express, we actually have a grant-making area specifically targeted to developing talent in the nonprofit sector, while Raphael focuses on the type of organizations his foundation is already supporting. We're really quite agnostic in terms of the types of organizations that we support. So we support social service organizations, we support arts organizations, we support environmental organizations, and so our grant making is different, but I think his grant making is probably more common than what I do. And so I think what we need to do in terms of trying to get foundations and corporations to do more in this area of providing support to leaders in the nonprofit sector is to think about the fact that the organizations that they support, the programs that they want to have impact in the community, how do you actually have success with that? And to us, I think you're hearing this loud and clear that if you don't develop the talent, if you don't develop the leaders in those organizations, they aren't going to be able to have the impact that you're interested in. They're not going to be able to scale. So we are really all about, and this initiative that has been referenced is all about trying to get funders to raise their profile, to raise the amount of resources available for developing talent in the sector. And so this is really the critical part. We see this as a very important time in terms of the demographic shift, the generational shift that's taking place, that this is really an opportunity for us to develop the talent so that they can drive these organizations into the future, make sure that the scaling that's going to take place is going to happen and that they have the talent to make that happen. Specifically at American Express, we have a number of different programs like our Leadership Academy and a number of organizations that we fund. And we really see in these programs that we fund the impact it's having on individuals. And I'll give you two examples. We run a Leadership Academy with the Center for Creative Leadership, and this is a program that we've been doing now since 2008. And a woman who went through one of our programs, she used to work for the Harlem Children's Zone. She called me up, and I want the folks who go through our program to continue to keep in touch with us. She called me up and said she wanted a meeting. She was very deliberate. She actually wanted to have a meeting with me. And so she came in, and this is someone who I remember at one of our leadership academies, but I don't remember her that well. And she came into the office, and she started talking to me about the new organizations that she was involved with. And we were talking about this work, and she was telling me about the importance of the work that she was doing. And then she reflected on the fact that without the leadership training that we provided her, she would never have had the guts to give me a call as a funder to come into that office and to talk to me about funding opportunities for this organization that she's involved with. And I was really struck by that because what I saw right before me was behavioral change in somebody who went through one of our training programs. She actually benefited directly from the coaching that we provided her, and she was now having an impact in an organization that she was now working for to fundraise for that organization. And it actually had an impact on me because we are going to be recruiting for our Leadership Academy starting this week, and I'll be calling her, and she's going to be able to identify people in her network to send to our Leadership Academy. So what she's done by making that phone call and taking that initiative, something that she would not have done and admitted to it, was the impact that we're having in the type of leaders that we're developing in the sector. Another quick example is we also fund iMentor, which is one of the Social Innovation Fund grantees. And I met with some of the folks that went through their program very recently, and there were 4 individuals in the room, and each one of them mentioned the importance of the leadership training that iMentor was providing them. And they referenced behavioral changes. Once more, they referenced behavioral changes that they actually have witnessed in themselves because of the training. And now here is a group that obviously is trying to scale, and the impact that this leadership training program is having, that this is the first time iMentor had ever done this. And it demonstrates to them 2 things. First of all, that iMentor cares about them and that they're willing to put the resources behind developing them, and that might lead to them retaining those individuals. But it also was having a dramatic effect on how they were actually doing their work day in and day out. So those are just examples of what funders can potentially do, what we're trying to do. And this initiative, which has been referenced by all of us on the panel, is hopefully going to get some of the funders there. And I was sitting in this chair just last year, and I spoke about the issue of leadership and that we were going to be doing some things to make sure that we can get more funders on board. Well, this is how it's materialized. And so we're going to now, I guess, take questions from
Yes, thank you. That data that you got from participants in your programs. And in that spirit, we want to open it up to the audience and invite you to ask questions of the panelists about the work that they've described or some of the challenges that they've identified. If you have feedback on the document, if you've had a chance to look at it, you can either share it now or there are ways to get in touch with them. And also to share your experience as people who we talked about before are directly involved in this work. What are your thoughts? What are your observations? What are the challenges you're facing with leadership as you're bringing organizations to scale? And what would you want funders to know? Since this initiative is really largely about engaging funders in understanding and then changing their own behavior, their grant-making behavior, to support this work more. What should they understand, appreciate, value, and support about leadership and scaling? And we have a little less than 15 minutes. Is there a mic or, yeah? Do I have it?
We have one on each. No, we have.
They're gonna
Oh, they're
circulate
going
them.
around?
Right.
Okay, great, even better. Okay, so let's see. So we will, Brandon, if you could come down, we'll start here, and then we'll go. Did you have your hand up? Yeah, we'll go over there. Thanks, and then we'll go to the other side of the room. Thank you.
Thanks. This was inspiring. A very simple question, though. My name is Mike Davidson. I do consulting work with boards, and I do a lot of executive director coaching. And I was really interested specifically in what Richard was talking about. Not Richard. What are the interventions that made a difference? I mean, you were talking about examples of people who came up and had an impact. But in the work that you guys have seen and what you're thinking about, what are the actual kinds of interventions that seem to make a difference in developing leadership in the sector? What works?
I think that we have, over the time that we've done our work with the Center for Creative Leadership, each person who goes through our program goes through a 360 evaluation, and on the Thursday of the week that they're with us, they have an executive coach speak to them for an hour and a half. And that has really demonstrated to us that the impact of that has been pretty profound on the individuals. And we often hear that portion of the program has been transformational for the individuals who have gone through it. And they really, in many cases, it's the first time they've ever had that type of direct feedback from somebody who has empathy, but who is direct and who's going to tell it like it is. They have there's no reason for them to BS them. And so that type of honest and sometimes raw feedback is transformational for the individuals who have gone through this effort. And that's every year we see the same type of feedback in terms of the evaluation that they do, that's a critical part of the program.
And I'd say, one of the things that we are looking to do with this, so one of the questions people, when we started off, they said, leadership, what do you mean, right? I mean, you'd pull everyone into this room and we'd have a discussion about what we mean by that, and we'd get a lot of different, probably more answers than there are people in the room kind of thing. So I think when we talked about more specifically leadership development, so very much to your point, one of the things we want to put more definition around is what do we mean by high quality? What do we know about the things that work? And one of the things I think that's happening right now in the sector that's happened in some ways in other sectors before us is that there's more evidence and there's more sense that, so coaching is a great example. I'm also an executive coach, and I remember in a lot of corporate environments, it's actually seen as like a demonstration that you're somebody who's arrived, that you have a coach. And still in the social sector, it's often like, oh God, what, am I going to be fired? Right? Like I did something wrong, that I actually need help. Do you think somebody needs help? And even the word intervention, right? The way we use this. So some of this is we are looking to, and this is part of this plan moving forward, we have to find ways, it's like the things we sort of know intuitively, how can we make sure that other people understand that that's true with the range of coaching? I also think it's something that all of us cited in some particular way, which is a level of intentionality. So whether it's that you're running the organization and it's how you build that into your systems, or it's that we have structures that can take, especially emerging leaders, and introduce them to, I always think of it like learning how to hold the tennis racket. For those of you who play tennis, you can play pretty well if you do it wrong, but if you learn good habits, you could actually take that a lot further forward. So as people are entering the sector, we want to build those kinds of habits into the practice.
Thank you. Over here.
Thanks. My name is Courtney Hawkins. I'm from FEGS. And this is exciting for me because I think in our work, this is the most important thing that I do every day is try to mentor our managers and our leaders. What I'm excited about is the fact that this is positioned as nonprofit talent and leadership, because what I've noticed is that often the solution has been to send people to executive MBA programs. And I'm wondering if you've given thought to how you're going to articulate how maybe nonprofit leadership and talent management might be slightly different than the private sector.
Yeah, you want to go first?
Sure. So it's interesting because we've actually had a version of this well, lots of us have had conversations about this. And it's interesting because, so we have a point of view. I would say I'm sort of come from the cross-sector point of view, which is that I think it's actually damaging when we say that a 360-degree program in American Express has no relevance for nonprofit organizations, when in fact, we know it does. And so for example, Richard uses it in his Leadership Academy. Casey uses a 360-degree feedback in a variety of our leadership development programs for the exact same reasons, because it works. And it's a tool in this larger sort of talent leadership development toolkit that has to be employed. So to your point of, does everybody who's in the nonprofit have to go get an executive MBA? The answer, we think, is no. But you have to be able to take what works from multiple sectors and apply it deliberately and consistently in the organization that you're worried about. And so what we're finding is that in many cases, sort of tied to this gentleman's first question, in coaching, in our grantees, we have a whole capacity building portfolio that I help run that's around finding the right tool for the right person and the right organization at the right time. So how we do senior leadership coaching to achieve financial sustainability, or there's a talent transition, and the coaching for that person or the team is the tipping point issue. So we might take an executive coach, or we might use a 360-degree feedback, or we might specifically design a leadership and action program for that executive and that particular organization to launch something more sort of community-wide and collaborative in nature using collaborative tools. And so I think it's not so much in this era one sector going to the other, because there's actually much more common, it's more common and more accepted for someone from the private sector to come to the social sector or nonprofits than it is the other way around. And what we're learning is that, particularly starting with Gen Xers and millennials, is that this notion of sectors really doesn't matter anymore. Why? Because you don't stay at a company for 30, 40 years anymore. You're having multiple jobs in your career, and you want to have a skill set that actually can cross sectors, and third, you actually want to make a difference. And the way you're making a difference is asking yourself, am I making a difference in the work that I'm doing? And taking that and applying it to multiple sectors, whether it's an executive MBA or an MPP or an MPA or an MSW, are all relevant, both in the research we've done and in the work that we've done in our program. So I would say that as we move this initiative forward, we'll probably have a very particular point of view on this. And I've been one of those folks in the group that says, put a stake in the ground. You may not agree with everybody, and everybody may not agree with you, but put it in the ground because we do know what works for lots of people. And that's sort of the perspective that I would say is one reflective voice of the conversations we've had.
Thank you. Hand up over there. Thanks. Oh, your mic is coming, yeah.
Hi, Nancy McGraw from the Corporation for Supportive Housing. And James, I was really intrigued by your comment about the thinking about outsourcing some of the paperwork or administrative functions of HR and bringing in-house a chief talent person. And we've gone through a process in the past 6 months to do a talent review and start to build in some new practices for our organization around changing our performance management system and looking at adding a workforce development plan to go along with our new strategic plan, and thinking about how to intentionally develop talent inside our organization. So just the question about that change of staffing inside the organization. What are there ideas or thoughts about how organizations can mechanically do that and pay for that kind of change? Are there some economies of scale within the industry we should be looking at? There are a couple of questions in there.
Yeah, there are a couple questions, but thank you for sharing the story, because I think I'm very familiar with the work that you guys have been doing over the last little bit, and it's excellent work. I think just to pull from a couple different places, a lot of the administrative HRs now, a lot of the payroll providers have started to adapt to providing those services, so Paychex and ADP, and a lot of times what organizations were paying $45,000 to have a junior level person on staff managing, they can outsource for $12,000, $15,000 a year, so there's a big cost savings there, and transferring that towards more strategic work. There's more outsourced solutions even beyond those types of providers. There are certainly folks who are going the route of having all of their employees sort of moved over to a management holding company where everyone becomes an employee of that company and the benefits become much more affordable to have higher level benefits. For most nonprofits, they're not big enough to warrant the either psychological or literal complexity of managing through that process. But I think where organizations are really strong is when they're thinking about, we need a strong in-house capacity to think strategically about whether or not we have the right people in the right roles, whether or not we are setting them up for success and managing them appropriately so that we can have them achieve the greatest possible impact in our organization, and whether or not we are developing them so that they can grow within their roles, but also so that they can be retained longer. We know that being continually challenged by your role is one of the top drivers of employment satisfaction and retention in an organization. And in a lot of organizations in our sector, it means we have smaller organizations, there aren't as many vertical rise opportunities, so I think progressive organizations are thinking about horizontal career ladders. You're going to be a director in 3 years, you're going to be a director in 7 years, but if you stay with me, you'll become a director of this, then you'll become a director of this, and then you'll become a director of this. You'll have a lot more responsibility, you'll be stretched in your role, there'll be more compensation associated with it. So, do we really have that competency in our organizations where we're thinking about the people, the management, the systems, and culture? This magic glue that holds all of our organizations together. Are we doing enough work to be intentional about our cultures? What is the culture that we seek to have in this organization? And what are we doing every single day to foster that culture or to tear it apart? And let me tell you, there's a lot of deliberate destruction of organizational culture in the pursuit of scaling and growth. And they cannot be mutually exclusive. They have to go hand in hand. And you have to recognize that your organizational culture will change and adapt as you grow. And that's okay. You can shed some parts of old culture and bring in some parts of new culture, but it's about having someone in the organization who's really thinking strategically about it. And we did a study a few years ago that was tragic to me. We looked at sort of number of FTEs across organizations of different sizes, and what you saw really clearly is that organizations who scaled from one stage of growth to the next, development staff grew, finance staff grew, technology staff grew, human capital staff dead even. We have one person who does this. It doesn't matter how big or small we are. That's all the FTEs I'm ever going to throw at it. And you look at some organizations who have totally broken the mold on that, like a Teach for America. Think about how many organizations in our sector would kill to get to 100 FTEs, to have 100 people on their staff working on their mission every day. Teach for America built a 100-person HR department. 100 people just in strategic human capital working in that organization. And yes, it's a big organization, but you know what Teach for America says? We underinvested in human capital, not nearly big enough. And so really thinking about, as we grow, building that capacity in our organization. I could go on for the next 3 hours, but I'll stop there.
Well, yeah, unfortunately,
Yeah.
we're at time, but that is quite a rallying cry and a very high note to end on. So I'd like to thank the panelists for sharing their wisdom and their provocative insights and recommendations. And thank you. And Cynthia's